Of course, here's a gripping introduction for your YouTube video story. I never thought one simple moment could turn my whole world upside down. But that's exactly what happened on an ordinary evening in my own home. It started with something small, something innocent, a sound, a splash of water, and then a feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I wish I had ignored it. I wish I had walked away, but I didn't. And that's when everything changed. It had been a long day, the kind that leaves you exhausted before the sun even sets. My husband, Mark, was out late for work again, something that had become all too common lately. I told myself not to overthink it. He was busy, stressed. He had reasons. But deep down, a part of me had started to wonder. That feeling had been creeping up on me for weeks, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, but I kept pushing it away. That night, as I went about my usual routine, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the television in the living room where I had left it on. But then I heard something else, a sound coming from the bathroom, running water. It wasn't unusual, but the timing was strange. My stepson, Ryan, was home, but he never took baths. He was always in and out of the shower in minutes. Yet, the water had been running for a while now, longer than usual. I hesitated outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I wasn't sure why I was so nervous, but something inside me urged me to check. Maybe it was just concern, or maybe it was that little voice inside me that had been warning me for weeks. I knocked softly. Ryan, everything okay in there? There was a pause, a hesitation, then a muffled response. Yeah, I'm fine. But something about his voice sounded wrong, unsteady, and that's when I made the decision that changed everything. I pushed the door open just a crack, just enough to see inside, and what I saw made my heart stop. Ryan wasn't alone. For a split second, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. The steam from the bath blurred the edges of the scene, but there was no mistaking it. There, in my own home, was a moment I was never supposed to witness. My stomach twisted as the realization hit me like a wave. My breath caught in my throat, and my entire body froze. The room fell into silence, thick and heavy, as Ryan's wide eyes met mine. And in that moment, I knew, whatever was happening, whatever secrets had been hiding in the shadows of this house, they were about to come crashing into the light. I wanted to run. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't, because now I was a part of it, and there was no turning back. Ryan's expression was a mix of shock and fear, his body half hidden behind the steam rising from the bath. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I knew I should say something, but the words wouldn't come. My fingers tightened around the doorknob, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The silence was unbearable. I could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his breath came too fast, too shallow. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, waiting to see what I would do next. But the truth was, I didn't know what to do. A part of me wanted to step away, to pretend I had never opened that door. But another part, the part that had been feeling something was off in this house for weeks, couldn't let it go. There were questions lingering in my mind, questions I had been too afraid to ask. Where was Mark right now? Why had he been acting so distant lately? And why did I suddenly feel like I was standing at the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to face? Ryan finally broke the silence. It's not what you think, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but that only made my stomach tighten. Because when someone says that, it usually is exactly what you think. Or worse. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Then tell me, what is it? He hesitated, glancing down as if searching for the right words. I. I can't, he finally muttered, shaking his head. Not now. His answer only made the pit in my stomach grow deeper. I could feel the weight of something unspoken between us, something bigger than just this moment, and I hated the way it made my skin crawl. I took a step back, gripping the door frame for support. My head felt light, dizzy, like the walls around me were closing in. Ryan, if there's something going on, you need to tell me. But he just looked away. Please, he said, his voice tight, just forget this happened. Forget? As if I could. As if I could just erase the image burned into my mind, the unease curling in my chest. I wanted to press him for answers, to demand the truth, but something in his eyes, something fragile, almost pleading, made me stop. I exhaled shakily and turned away, my mind spinning. I didn't know what was happening, not yet, but I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the scene in the bathroom, twisting it into something even worse. Ryan's expression, the way he begged me to forget, it haunted me. But how could I? Something was happening in this house, something I wasn't seeing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being kept in the dark. Mark didn't get home until late. I listened as he moved around the house, his footsteps heavy, his movements slow. He barely spoke to me anymore, and when he did, it felt forced, like he was going through the motions of a conversation without actually being present. It had been this way for weeks, maybe even longer, but I had convinced myself it was just stress, work, life. Now, I wasn't so sure. I thought about confronting him right then, but the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? That I walked in on his son acting strangely? That something felt wrong, even though I couldn't explain why? I needed more proof, more understanding. So instead, I stayed quiet, pretending everything was normal even though nothing felt that way anymore. The next morning, Ryan avoided me completely. No eye contact, no conversation. He barely touched his breakfast before mumbling an excuse and heading out. I watched him go, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he hiding something from me? Or was it someone else? I picked up my phone, my hands trembling slightly as I scrolled through my messages. Mark had been distant. Ryan was acting strange. And suddenly, I had the sinking feeling that whatever was happening, I was about to uncover something I wasn't prepared for. The uneasy feeling in my stomach only grew as the day went on. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out what was really going on. I started piecing things together, revisiting every odd moment from the past few weeks. Mark's late nights, the hushed phone calls he always took in another room, the way Ryan had been on edge lately. And then there was last night, his panicked expression, his desperate plea for me to forget. None of it added up, and yet I knew deep down that it did. I just wasn't seeing the full picture yet. That evening, Mark came home earlier than usual, but instead of relief, I felt dread. He barely looked at me as he walked past, his shoulders tense, his mind clearly somewhere else. I watched him closely, studying every move. I had lived with this man for years. I knew when something was off, and right now, everything was. Ryan was still avoiding me, staying in his room with the door locked. My chest tightened as I stood outside, debating whether to knock. But before I could decide, I heard something. A low voice, his voice. But he wasn't alone. Someone was in there with him. I held my breath, straining to hear. The words were muffled, urgent, but I caught enough to know that this wasn't just a casual conversation. It was something more, something secret. My heart pounded as I slowly leaned in closer, desperate for any clue. And then, just as I thought I was about to hear something that would make it all make sense, Ryan's door suddenly swung open. His face was pale, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. And standing behind him, frozen in place, was the last person I ever expected to see. Time seemed to freeze as I locked eyes with the person standing behind Ryan. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what I was seeing. But there they were, standing in my home, in Ryan's room, Mark, my husband. A cold wave of confusion and dread crashed over me. Why was he here? Why was he in Ryan's room with the door shut, speaking in hushed voices? My mind raced, searching for an explanation that made sense, but nothing did. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear, his face pale, his jaw tight. Mark, on the other hand, straightened his posture, his expression unreadable, almost too calm. I can explain, Mark said, his voice steady. Too steady. I stared at him, my chest tightening. Then explain, I whispered, my voice barely holding together. Ryan looked away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I could see the conflict written all over his face. He was scared. But of what? Or who? My stomach twisted as possibilities ran through my mind, each one worse than the last. Mark took a slow step forward, but I instinctively backed away. I didn't trust him, not in this moment. It's not what you think, he said, his tone too rehearsed, too careful. I let out a bitter laugh, though nothing about this felt funny. Then tell me what it is, Mark, I shot back, because right now, I don't even know what to think. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Just stop, he muttered, his voice breaking. It's done. She knows something is going on. My heart pounded. Knows what? I demanded, looking between them. What are you both hiding from me? Mark clenched his jaw, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt. That was all it took for my stomach to drop. I had been right. Something had been happening. Something they had both been keeping from me. Then Ryan did something that shattered any last hope I had of this being a misunderstanding. He turned to Mark, his voice cold, distant. Just tell her the truth, he said. She deserves to know. I braced myself, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever Mark was about to say, I knew it was G. Mark exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping as if he had been carrying a weight too heavy to bear. His eyes flickered toward Ryan, then back to me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something raw in them. Fear. But fear of what? Or who? I didn't want you to find out like this, he finally said, his voice low. I felt the ground beneath me shift. My breath hitched. Find out what, Mark? Ryan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. She already knows something's wrong. Lying isn't going to fix it. Mark clenched his jaw, then turned to me. Ryan got into trouble, he said carefully. The kind that could ruin everything if it got out. I blinked. What are you talking about? Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. It's not just me, okay? Dad's involved too. I froze. A chill ran down my spine. Involved how? Mark ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly exhausted. There's money missing, he admitted. From my company. My stomach dropped. What? Ryan's jaw tightened. Dad was using company funds for personal things, trips, gifts, things he didn't want you to know about. I found out, and I tried to cover for him. I could barely process his words. My head spun. So, this is what you've been hiding? Mark stepped forward. I was going to fix it before anyone noticed, he said quickly. But Ryan found out, and things got complicated. He tried to help, but it only made things worse. Now the company is looking into it, and if they find out what happened, I felt sick. You were stealing? My voice cracked. Mark, how could you? Because I had no choice, he snapped. I was in too deep, and if they find out, I could lose everything. We could lose everything. I shook my head in disbelief. And you dragged Ryan into this? Ryan's expression darkened. I had to protect him, even if he didn't deserve it. The weight of the truth crushed down on me. Mark had been lying to me, stealing, covering his tracks. And Ryan, he had been caught in the middle, trying to fix something that was never his fault. But then, just as I thought I understood everything, Ryan's next words shattered me completely. There's more, he said quietly, looking me straight in the eyes. Dad wasn't just spending that money on himself. He hesitated, then added, he was spending it on someone else. And in that moment, I knew the missing money, the secrecy, the distance between us. Mark hadn't just betrayed his company, he had betrayed me, owing to change everything. And I wasn't sure I was ready for it,